Chris Carter here from the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, here with Ray Fittipaldo today. Now the Steelers are bounced from the playoffs for a sixth straight playoff appearance. We got to talk about what the Steelers are thinking by keeping Mike Tomlin. We talk about that and specifically what could be the reasoning behind it, as well as other coaches who could be on the chopping block, all here in the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with one of our great Steelers beat writers, Ray Fittipaldo. And as always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. As always, the show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Whether you're injured in a car accident or hurt on the job, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injured victims for over 40 years, recover more than $2 billion on their behalf. If you or a loved one have been seriously injured in an accident, call 1-800-94-EDGAR and visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray, some Steelers fans feel like they're owed a fee after watching that Steelers playoff game. The Steelers also, our own Gerry Dulac comes out and reports, the day after the game that the Steelers plan to not be moving on from Mike Tomlin here. Real quick before we get into all the other things, I want to clear this out because I know that one of the things, I said this beforehand, when people were talking about, whether or not the Steelers would fire Mike Tomlin, A, he just signed a 3-year extension. Right. B, he has a no trade clause. But could this, there's a question, could there be a ruse here? Could there be a disguise here for this to be like, oh, we're saying that now, but then they will trade him for big thing? Or is this straight up, this is what the Steelers do? They're keeping Tomlin, and that's just what it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if they did ponder anything, Chris, I mean, Gerry Dulac of our paper had a story up at noon yesterday or 1 o'clock. So if it didn't take him very long. I mean, it was basically 12 hours removed from one of the worst playoff losses in team history. So if they did indeed ponder it, it didn't take them long to come to any conclusions. And honestly, Chris, I don't think that would have been leaked to Gerry if they planned to trade him. That just doesn't make any sense on their part, right? I mean, if he indeed is a commodity around the league, they wouldn't say he's coming back and then turn around and trade him. So to me, it's a done deal. I think everyone realized, was it June or July that he signed the extension? I think everyone realized 6 months ago at that time that Mike Tomlin was going to be here in 2025. And just because the season ended in fashion that no one saw coming, it doesn't change the way the Rooneys do business. The Rooneys do not typically move on from coaches who are under contract, and certainly not with 2 years remaining on that contract.
Right, and that's the thing that the Rooneys have not done. But let's talk about that as far as that philosophy and how they've operated in that. The Steelers are famous for only having 3 coaches since 1969. All 3 coaches have become Super Bowl winners. And, I think that, in the 70s, you could say like, well, okay, Chuck Noll came in, he took some years to rebuild, but quickly built the dynasty. But Bill Cowher, you could say, came in, had a run in his first few years, but then his team did go to disaster. Like they had a 7-9 season in 98, a 6-10 season in 99. They missed the playoffs 3 years in a row. And that's something the Steelers haven't done since that happened. And then another 6-10 season a couple of years after that. But at the same time, I remember as a kid, I wasn't old enough to be in the business, but I remember as a kid reading stories about like, man, the Steelers are really putting a lot of faith in Bill Cowher to figure this out, even though he hasn't been to the playoffs for 3 years, even though he's not doing that. And in fact, stories from this paper, from some of our senior writers that used to be on staff here. And I remember, thinking as a kid, I'm like, well, I guess that means, the Rooneys have something they believe in. And I remember also, I'm in high school, I see Bill Cowher holding up a Super Bowl trophy, and it made the Rooneys look smart. Like, hey, they believed in this guy. They knew that he could figure it out. And so I ask you, Ray, is that kind of what they're doing here, is saying that, hey, we think we see a light at the end of the tunnel? And I think that's the thing that Steelers fans are having a hard time grasping right now, is like, what light is there when this is now the 6th straight playoff loss, 5th straight one and done for the Steelers in the playoffs?
Yeah, when the Rooneys feel like, they have a quality coach and a quality person at the top of their organization. They're not quick to move on from them. And I think you saw that with Chuck Noll. I mean, Chuck was here for 23 seasons before they decided it was time to move on. And then, Bill Cowher, 15 season, you brought it up, he had 3 years in a row when he didn't make the playoffs. And, Mike's not in that type of a stretch now, but, I would argue that, the lack of success in the playoffs is probably a little bit more concerning than merely missing for 3 years in a row. If you want to look at it in that way, just the idea that they're getting to a certain point and they don't seem to be able to, to get over the hump. If you look back at Cowher's tenure, he had a quarterback who got him to a Super Bowl early, Neil O'Donnell. Then O'Donnell moves on, and then they kind of cycled through quarterback. It was Mike Tomczak, it was Cordell Stewart, was Tomczak and Graham, and then they go back to Stewart and
Maddox.
Yeah, and to Bill Cowher's credit, and Mike has done this to a certain extent the last couple of years. To Cowher's credit, he was still able to get to the playoffs. With Cordell, being a little bit, of an up and down player, right? And even, Mike Tomczak in 1996, the year O'Donnell left, they still got to the playoffs. They were a good team. They just couldn't make a run in the playoffs. I think that's what you're seeing now when you don't have a franchise quarterback. It's hard to compete, for a Super Bowl. But the Steelers are getting there every year. To me, Chris, the question the Rooneys have to ask is, how do we help Mike Tomlin now? How do we get him in better position to win some playoff games? I think the quarterback is the obvious place to start. But I think there's a lot of other issues with this team too. You could talk about organizational philosophy and all the resources they put into defense. That's really the opposite of the way other teams approach it. And you could talk about the way they've built their roster, keeping guys maybe who are past their prime or into their prime, and they're eating up a lot of the salary cap. So there are things we're going to discuss this offseason. It's not going to be a quiet offseason. There's a lot of decisions that they have to make. But, to me, I think the first thing the Rooneys have to do, you're keeping Mike Tomlin. Now you have to figure out what pieces can we give him so we ensure this doesn't happen again.
No, I agree. I think that's part of it here. And that's kind of where I was going to go a little bit next here. How much of this is also needing Mike Tomlin or needing to keep together the front office with Mike Tomlin as far as balancing that? Because that was another thing that happened, I think, in Cowher's favor was, they brought Kevin Colbert in 2000? And, that was coming off of, you look at some of the picks that happened before Kevin Colbert. The year before that, Troy Edwards was the 13th overall pick. They did pick Faneca as a Hall of Fame lineman in the first round the year before that. But Chad Scott, Jermaine Stevens, Charles Johnson, Deion Figures, Leon Searcy, a lot of those guys weren't big contributors, for the Steelers in the late 90s there. And that was, a big problem with some of those draft picks. And then Kevin Colbert comes in, gets Plaxico Burress, Marvell Smith, Casey Hampton, Kendra, and then they quickly start to get a jump start with some of the players that they've added there. And so now you look at Omar Khan and Andy Weidel and what they're doing with Mike Tomlin. You see them add Broderick Jones. Yes, Broderick needs to grow, but there's still potential for him to do that there. We still haven't gotten to see Troy Fautano and what he's actually like. And then you see guys like, Keeanu, Benton stepping up. I think that part of this might also be there's an acknowledgement that, like, hey, the Steelers at the end of the Colbert era, for as great as the start was, you go from 18 to 21 in his last 18 to 22 in his last 5 drafts there. Terrell Edmonds, Devin Bush, no first rounder, but in 2020. Najee Harris, Kenny Pickett. If Najee Harris isn't re-signed to a contract, none of those players will be on the Steelers next year. And that's 5 years of first round picks not there. And I think that's where it's like, hey, they have rebuilding to do, not just at quarterback, but in a lot of places because they missed for so many years.
Yeah, and I think Kevin Colbert will tell you the acquisition of Minkah was like having a first round pick because he was only in his second season. So I just want to throw that out there. But you're right. They swung and missed on Devin Bush. This big topic on the internet this weekend. You take Terrell Edmonds, 3 spots before Lamar Jackson goes. Not that they could have. I guess they could have taken a quarterback there, but you run the risk of ruffling the feathers of of your franchise quarterback if you do. So that's debatable. But
they ruffled his feathers with a 3rd-round pick. He was upset about Mason Rudolph.
Exactly. So hey, I guess you could look back 2020 and say maybe they should have ruffled him even more. But listen, I think there's always going to be critiques of the front office. I mean, the end for Colbert wasn't great, but Andy Weidel is here now. I think he believes in rebuilding through the trenches. They've done that the last couple of years with the offensive line. Chris, the draft is going to be a huge topic for us in the coming weeks up until the combine. To me, the defensive line has to be rebuilt.
I agree.
Heyward had an awesome year, all pro season. To me, you bring him back on that contract, even though he's going to cost you, I think, 14 or 15 million. You got to bring him back because he's your only good player.
Yeah.
Keeanu Benton's solid, but quite honestly, I expected a little bit more out of him this year as a pass rusher.
He's not a game changer yet.
He's not a game changer. Ogunjobi, I could see them moving on from Ogunjobi.
Yeah.
And just Adams, Lowry, Loudermilk, all those guys are just guys, right? And there's nobody coming up who's going to push any of those guys out. So to me, maybe you do it in free agency too, but I think they got to get better up front on their defense. That was a huge issue in that game against the Ravens, 300 yards rushing, and it was a huge issue, honestly, over the final month of the season. They just got pushed around way too much, and that can't happen to a Steelers defense.
No, I agree. We'll talk more about what the Steelers defense needs to change, because if Mike Tomlin's staying, that means someone else has to be going at some point. Will Teryl Austin be on the chopping block? We'll talk about that next here on the North Shore Drive podcast for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. If you're injured in an accident, you're probably wondering what's next. Well, for over 40 years, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injured victims answer that very question, what's next? Whether it's gathering evidence, collecting medical records, or dealing with the insurance companies, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped over 75,000 people handle the what's next question. Call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. Remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's dive into the defense a little bit. You talked about the defensive line. We'll get to Karl Dunbar and the coaching of the defensive line in a bit. We got to start at the top of the defense. That's Teryl Austin. Now, he did just sign an extension in January 2024 for 2 years. So technically, I believe that means he would be on contract through the end of the 25 season, or about the end of the 26 season. I always forget how that works.
25.
25. So he's on the books for the Steelers next year. But it feels like, especially when you have a game where you give up 300 yards on the ground in the playoffs, and your strength is supposed to be stopping the run and bringing heat, and you get no sacks in Lamar Jackson, and you get bulldozed in the run game. It seems like the entire Steelers defensive philosophy didn't work in the game that they needed it to work the most in. So with that being said, is Teryl Austin just the guy that has to kind of fall on the sword for this defense right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's the cold part of this business. There sometimes, Chris, you can't change all the players, so you have to find a scapegoat on the coaching staff. And I think Teryl Austin, I do think that move will be under consideration. Now, the interesting aspect of that decision is Mike Tomlin really is a big part of that defense, right? I mean,
he is.
He is the one who. He didn't bring Dick LeBeau back. He wanted more ownership of that defense. And I think since Keith Butler was here and then Teryl Austin, it was kind of like Mike is the DC, and these guys, sure, they help game plan, they help play calling, but Mike has ownership of the defense. So that's part of, this discussion here. Certainly I think you could look to maybe Art Rooney and maybe Art going to Mike and say, hey, listen, Mike, you're going to hire a new defensive coordinator, but maybe the arrangement has to be different. I don't know if that conversation is going to be had. Maybe the new coordinator will have more say-so of how things go. I don't think that would be a bad idea now, given the way things have gone here late in the season. And it just wasn't the final Ravens game. It was the the December 21st Ravens game.
Yeah.
It was the Eagles game. I mean, the Chiefs game was a disaster. I mean, it was a disaster for five weeks running, and changes have to be made. And yeah, I think it's unfortunate, but Teryl is probably going to be one of the guys who pays the price.
Yeah, you take out that Bengals game where I thought the defense at least showed up against them. They had four out of the last 5 games they were just destroyed, and I think that's something that you have to look at there. And to your point about Mike Tomlin, I do think that his defensive coordinators have some sort of autonomy, not complete autonomy, of course, but like you go back to the Keith Butler years, they specialized in trying to send blitzes at you and what they did to try to spice things up front, but they were very bland in the back end. Teryl Austin becomes the defensive coordinator. They try to spice things up on the back end, but it looks like they're kind of bland up front. We talked about all season long and how they need to move TJ Watt around. They need to move him around because teams are scheming him up. And you look at that Ravens game, the Ravens, they made sure that he was double teamed, chipped, triple teamed, whatever he needed to do. And he had no stats to give. That was their game plan, was to limit him. And when you don't move him around, it makes him easy to do so. So I think you're at the point where you're the Steelers, where you need a defensive coordinator who can do both, who can scheme up a secondary to have things behind them that are complex and fast paced and force mistakes, as well as a front that can do the same thing and create challenges for offenses to face. And I think that's the challenge they face here, in finding a person. And then there is the question, how much autonomy does that person get for making their own scheme versus doing what Mike Tomlin's telling them to do? And I think it's also important to know that, again, it's not that Mike Tomlin does everything on the defense. It's not that it's just his. I mean, you can go back to that Packers game last year where Minkah Fitzpatrick's yelling directly at Teryl Austin to change the play at the end of the game, and not at Mike Tomlin. So you're like Austin and Butler had roles, but at the same time, Mike Tomlin, that's his specialty. That's what he's supposed to be able to get out of it. And listen, most of his years here, the Steelers have had a good to good, and some years they've had a great defense. But I'd say it probably has been since 2020, 2019 that they've had a great defense. I think they've had some, like, this was a good defensive year, but it wasn't a great one. And that was the problem. When you pay as much as you do, the Steelers are the most expensive defensive team have the most expensive defensive roster in the NFL. You need that group to be great, and it wasn't this year.
Yeah, I mean, you look at what Minkah said a couple of weeks ago. He said we are getting schemed up. So, I mean, what does that mean? I mean, basically means our schemes are not working, and our roles,
and teams are seeing what you're doing and countering it.
Yeah, our roles that we are applying are not working when teams have answers for us. I mean, that's basically what he was saying. I mean, look at one of the changes they made for this game, Chris. How many times did you see in years past TJ Watt come crashing in, and his responsibility was Lamar Jackson on all those read options, and he would hit the heck out of Lamar Jackson whether he had the ball or not? That's a legal play. If you're going to be a runner or attempt to be a runner on an option, you are allowed to be hit. And they changed up their rules in this game. They had TJ crashing in, and TJ was hitting Derrick Henry. And that's the way they drew it up. And, they had other people responsible for Lamar Jackson. Supposedly, he was running free, the first quarter and much of the second quarter. People weren't even getting a hand on him, and he had 10 or 15 yards. So, what they're doing is not working. They got to change it. I think Mike has to be open-minded too. He has had trouble going out and, getting big-name hires, other than Mike Munchak. Todd Haley worked out. He was a former head coach, but Todd only worked for a while. Mike's had a hard time drawing assistants who are maybe have their own ideas. And I think maybe if Mike does give more ownership to a coach, maybe he can attract a guy who has a resume. And if he lets him if he lets him implement some things, maybe Mike could be more of an overseer, and maybe that's one way to affect change. But I think it's obvious they got to change a lot of things on defense, and I think that's going to start with likely some new coaches coming in.
Absolutely. I know some people are screaming, why aren't you talking about Arthur Smith? And I feel like it's different for Arthur Smith because he got to Pittsburgh with 1 year. So I have a hard time seeing them move on from him unless he takes a head coaching job, which apparently he's done multiple interviews, or he's been requested for multiple interviews. I don't think he's done them yet. So like maybe that's a thing, but I have a hard time seeing that happen at this stage simply because of the fact that the Steelers just got the offensive coordinator, and you'd want to give him at least a couple years to see, okay, this is what went wrong this year. Let's see what goes better next year. And then, there's plenty of other questions that have on the offense, but I want to talk about two specific position coaches that involved in the trenches. The offensive line coach, Pat Meyer, the defensive line coach, Karl Dunbar. We'll talk about both of those guys and their statuses next here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, remind you, the show is also brought to you by Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. They're your Metzger and his bestest lawyers with over 85 years of experience. Call them today for a free consultation. That's Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. We're also brought to you by Moon Township Honda, where you can get your new Honda vehicle at 5802 University Boulevard in Moon Township, PA, or go visit their website, moonhonda.com. Here's a message from our friends at Moon Township Honda.
It's that time of year again to get the Honda of your dreams during Happy Honda Days, where you'll find great offers on a sporty new Civic, spirited Accord, fun-to-drive HRV, and versatile CRV. So don't wait. Turn your holiday dreams into reality with a new Honda named KBB.com's best value brand. Buy online, reserve from select dealers, or visit your local Honda dealer today.
Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, we talked about Tomlin. We talked about Austin. We've glanced there at Arthur Smith and acknowledged that's probably not going to happen. But where other things could happen are position coaches. And I think one position group that we can all agree upon that underperformed this year was the offensive line. Granted, 2 rookies starting on it for the majority of the season. Zach Frazier, a rookie you wanted starting on it at center. Mason McCormick came in to fill in for James Daniels, who, being fair to the Steelers offensive line, was their best offensive lineman in the early part of this year. Losing him was a big blow. Isaac Seumalo, I felt underperformed. Dan Moore started off strong the year, I thought, and then just faded into became as bad as he had been in his career for the Steelers. Broderick Jones, I felt like had some good games, but had some bad games. And then you see at the end of the season, he's having fundamental mistakes there as well. And so obviously that pulls into view Pat Meyer and saying, what has happened here? He's had 2 years to help develop Broderick Jones. That hasn't led to good things. This group looked disjointed and uncoordinated at times. And if you're looking at position coaches, is he the first one that's at risk?
Listen, there's no argument. The offensive line was really bad at the end of the season. I thought they started off well. I thought the running game was good, during portions of the season. But when you look at the way the season ended, they weren't knowing their assignments, Chris.
Yeah.
Technique was bad. Fundamentals were bad. And, whether it's his fault or not, that's on Pat Meyer. You can't have second and third year guys going out there and being as poor fundamentally as some of those guys were. So that's a huge issue. So like Teryl Austin, Pat Meyer is under contract for one more season. He re-upped last year. I suppose, we could ask Mike Tomlin, and I'm sure Mike had a good reason for this, but he re-signed Pat Meyer before Arthur Smith was even hired last year. And typically when you bring in a new OC, you let him bring in most of his assistants. And listen, Art was able to do that with Zach Azzani and, some other positions, but he wasn't able to do that with his offensive line. And, Art's an offensive line guy. I'm sure he had some sort of a relationship with Pat, and I'm sure there was a reason Mike did it. Maybe Pat, there was a reason why he had to make that move at that time. I don't know the reason, but in the end, somebody has to pay the price. The offensive line hasn't been good enough, Chris. You poured a lot of draft resources into it. I understand they're still young, but to your point, they should be better than this by now.
I agree. And I think last year, partially the reason maybe you kept Pat Meyer was the way that they finished the season. You look at how they ran the ball against the Bengals, the Seahawks, and the Ravens to close out the year. They were running the ball pretty well, and they got over 100 yards in each of those games. Against the Seahawks, it was over 200 yards and over 150 yards against the Ravens in a game they needed to win. They needed to win those games to make the playoffs. And so you were looking like, okay, looks like they started to have some things clicking. Broderick Jones finished better at the end of the year, but you didn't see that carry into this season. I mean, maybe you saw it for a little bit, like you said, early on, especially that middle part of the season. Once like the offensive line, I think once the team started to click a little bit more, they had the Raiders, Jets, and Giants games. I mean, actually looking at it, the early part of the season, they had over 100 rushing yards as a team for every game except the Cowboys loss going into that stretch at the end of the season. And then they only rushed for 56 yards against the Eagles, only rushed for 74 yards against the Bengals in the regular season finale, and then only 29 yards against the Ravens in the playoffs. And so, yeah, they fell off, and that's where you have to look at, I think, and say, hey, like, is there a different approach needed here? Is there some sort of change that needs to be had as far as approaching how you coach, especially young offensive linemen, because that's the group that needs to improve. And again, being fair, like you said, Zach Frazier, I thought had a good year. Mason McCormick, 4th round rookie. You weren't expecting him to have to start this year. I think he had some really good weeks. I think he had some really bad weeks. Same thing with Broderick Jones, still very up and down. But maybe it does take getting someone to come in here and straighten this group out so that the young guys and whichever old guys you do keep around, or old guy you keep around, because I presume Falton was going to be back next year and healthy. Broderick Jones, Zach Frazier, McCormick might all be back are probably all back as starters. So you're probably looking at Isaac Seumalo, or if you don't keep him, someone else that would fill his place.
Yeah, I mean, listen, they don't have to make a decision on Broderick Jones until next year at this time. But
right,
when first-round draft picks underperform, and especially when you trade up to get a guy like that, you point right to the position coach. And again, whether it's his fault or not, Broderick Jones is not developing at the rate he should be as a first-round pick, and that's a problem for the Steelers, and ultimately, that's a problem for Pat Meyer. So they got to figure out a way to get him playing really well. You mentioned Fautano. I think he's going to be really good if he can stay healthy. I thought Frazier was the best offensive lineman all season. And,
absolutely.
Yeah, and listen, Seumalo, he's on the books for I think $8 million in 2025. I suppose you bring him back because you probably don't want to use another high pick on a guard. So, you hope he's better in 2025. But when your best offensive lineman is a rookie, you got other first-round picks underperforming, and you got a high-priced free agent who's underperforming, it's not all on the coach. These guys are pros. They're responsible for how they prepare for games and how they play. And, that's the way it is. And unfortunately, Chris, you can't change out all the players. And sometimes it's easier to blame the coach. And that's a direction this one might head as well.
I think so, too. Let's talk about the other side of the trenches. Karl Dunbar. As a defensive line coach, I think he's had some really good things. And it's hard to put everything on him because the defensive front, again, Cam Heyward's been phenomenal. I think Keeanu Benton has been solid. Like you said, he hasn't been very good just yet. But the line is also where it takes time to develop. Cam Heyward didn't become the man, the superstar that he was until probably year 5 or 6 in his career. He was kind of like Keeanu Benton early on, solid for his first few years before he became Mr. Cam Heyward that carries the flag for the Steelers wherever he goes. So maybe you give him more time on Benton, but you look at, like you said, Ogunjobi, you look at Lowry, Adams, everything else, Loudermilk, guys that just weren't really good contributors for the most part for the Steelers defensive line. And you wonder, is his job safe, especially if the Teryl Austin does go in this situation. What position coaches do you keep on defense? Because I think these guys have pretty great track records. Like, Denzel Martin is a heck of a outside linebackers coach. I think Aaron Curry's done a really good job with the inside linebackers. I think Grady Brown has been a decent secondaries coach. But you got it with a new defensive coordinator. You're probably going to need to shake some things up on that side as well.
Yeah, I think that's only fair. When you bring in a new DC, I think you want him to be comfortable, and like you allowed with Arthur Smith, you let him bring in some of his own guys. And I think that if they do make a change at DC, I think, Austin wouldn't be the only assistant coach to go. So, as far as Dunbar goes, he's been here a while. Sometimes, Chris, you just need a new voice. And it's not saying Dunbar has done a bad job. I tend to think that it's more about the resources you pour into the line, and, nothing against Loudermilk, but he was a 4th-round pick or a 5th-round pick. What do you expect? Logan Lee, rookie on IR this year. He's a 6th-round pick. Not all these guys are going to be Brett Kiesel and develop into really good players as 7th-rounders. Now, maybe you hit on one and maybe you really develop him, and that's an asset for you. But to me, you got to start pouring resources into the D-line. Yeah, they used the 2nd-round pick on Benton. But listen, if there's a first-round difference maker available for you in the 20s where you're going to draft this year, maybe you do pull the trigger this year. At the very least, you got to think about using your second-round pick on another guy to bolster that front, because right now it's just not nearly good enough.
It's not nearly good enough. And what's funny is I thought going into this year, even assuming that, like, hey, there'll be time to kind of develop guys, because Keeanu Benton might come along. Larry Ogunjobi's under contract. You can keep him around with Cam Heyward. But they need even before that, I thought it would be smart to draft a young, talented defensive lineman at the top of your draft, to have another just anti-road grader, a guy that's going to control the line of scrimmage, so that you have that 1-2 punch with Keeanu Benton for the next however long you want to keep them. The way they hoped that they'd have that with Cam Heyward and Stephon Tuitt before Stephon Tuitt had to retire earlier in his career. And I thought even before that, but now it's like, it's not only do you need to find that future guy, you need to find that now guy if you want to be this defense. And that's why I know a lot of people want to say, go get Emeka Egbuka at the number 1 pick and at wide receiver. But I think D-line and corner are big needs there, and we can get to corner another day. But to your point, great position coaches. I think sometimes there are times that people blur the vision on what's a good or a great position coach or a bad position coach, just simply because of the talent they have in the room. Mike Munchak deserves a ton of credit. He's a Hall of Famer. He did a lot of things, but Mike Munchak had 2 all-pro guys lined up next to each other. But by the time that he got to Pittsburgh, he had Pouncey and DeCastro. Marcus Gilbert was a really good asset, and he had Foster. And then so he had guys like Chris Hubbard and Alejandro Villanueva that kind of came in and filled in over the years. But it made it easier to do that when you had 2 all-pro guys in the middle part of your line holding it down. Right. And I think the same thing needs to be with the D-line. They need another stalwart guy who can line up there, be a difference maker, and create havoc for the Steelers defense.
Yeah, one thing we could talk about in the coming weeks is I think if you cut Larry Ogunjobi, I think you save $7 million.
You do.
Maybe you go out and spend in free agency. Maybe there's a free agent defensive lineman who's in that 26 age range, and you think you can get the best years out of him. Maybe you invest in free agency on a guy. When's the last time they really went after a big free agent defensive lineman? It's been a while. They did it with Patrick Queen. I don't know if a lot of people were expecting that Patrick Queen move. Maybe it's time to not only address it in the draft, Chris, but make some changes and maybe invest some of your cap money in the line as well.
No, I'm right with you there. Investing in the cap, listen, they have plenty of cap money right now. I think officially they have $52.3 million in cap space. That will increase significantly because Preston Smith's a $13.4 million cap hit. They are not keeping him for that if they keep him at all. So that jumps you up to about 65 million there. And then you throw in Larry Ogunjobi, a $7 million cap savings you can get by letting him go. So now you're talking about jumping up to $72 million, and that's before you cut anyone else or make any other trades or restructure contracts and things like that. And bigger questions about guys like Minkah Fitzpatrick, who I think wasn't a bad player for most of the season, but wasn't the game changer that you're paying him $22.3 million for. And so you gotta ask questions about how they're going to handle that. That's where I think the Steelers are going to be looking next year. And if you at least we're talking about right there $75 million or so to play with, that's good money. That's good money to work with. You can sign a couple really good players with that, and then other role players around them. So, but the question is, where do you want to put that money? D-line, corner, receiver, elsewhere? We'll talk more about that because we have a long offseason ahead of us and a lot of time to do that. He's Ray Fittipaldo. I'm Chris Carter. Thanks again for tuning into the North Shore Drive podcast. It's Monday that we're recording this on. We are headed to the Steelers locker room this afternoon to talk to the players as they're doing locker clean out. We'll get all that here and more and keep you posted with all the changes coming for the Steelers heading into the 2025 season. Keep it here at the North Shore Drive podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Remember, we're every Monday, Wednesday, Friday on your favorite podcast apps and on YouTube. Like this if you enjoyed, subscribe to this channel to get all of those episodes. And remember to subscribe to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette at post-gazette.com. See you here Wednesday on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.